Hello, good morning. Today, myself, Rahul, Lavanya, and Kirti are going to briefly give a review about the research paper analysis of complexity of insider attacks to databases. And coming to the introduction, what is an insider attack? It is like one of the most dangerous threats to the organization, and they are difficult to foresee, detect, and defend as well due to the trust and responsibilities placed on the employees. Though a lot of budget is assigned to the security department to detect and respond to the cyber attacks, still the threat persists, and it is one of the most important of insider attack is that unauthorized account openings, money transfers, identity thefts, and credit frauds. And according to the survey of 2018 Global State of Information Security Survey, which says 30% of the security incidents are from the current employees and 26% of them from our former employees. The main difficulty in handling these kind of insider attacks are because we are dealing with the trusted employees, which we have trust on the current employees, while the restrictive policies are on a legitimate employee. Then it's difficult for that employee to adapt to a different condition. And a legit activity from a legit employee, which can be different, although the intent is normal. So these are the conditions which are tough. And coming to the contributions of the paper, uh, the paper defines the belief of a user intent and construct a model for the common scenarios that poses a very high risk for sensitive data stored in the organization databases. And second, we'll build a threat model for insider attacks in the context of relation databases, analyzing the counter actions against the model threat. Next, we'll provide a computational complexity analysis for both threat and the different mechanisms. And coming to the intent model, well, SQL queries, a user issues on issues an SQL query, a user issues on a database could be normal behavior. Like, and also a similar queries in nature might imply similar action. However, understanding the intent behind the query, like the thought process of writing the query, is regarded as hard as constructing a new query because we never know the query as when the query is more complicated, the intent, knowing the intent behind the query is even more difficult. So for this reason, it's tough to know the intent behind the query. For knowing the intent behind the query, we have few feature extraction methods. There's a SQL feature extraction to capture the intent of the query has been studied for performance optimization, workload analysis, query recommendation, security purposes. Uh, the feature extraction essentially extracts projection selections, joins, group by, order by items from SQL query to be used in the query similarity comparison. And sometimes different queries are written for the same set of features. And sometimes queries that aim to perform the same task can produce different features as well. Of course, the result will also depend upon the data stored in the database. From the example which you see here, select all from user, where username like starts with like A from A. And from the second query, select all from the user. These two queries might result in the same result. In the sense like in the first query, if the data consists of all names with the A, then the first and the two queries give the same result, and they give the different, depending upon the data, they might give different results as well. Hence, the query can be written with different interpretations, which makes it tough to interpret the intent of the query, but still possible to sense the aim of the query. Like to sense the aim of the query, the intent of the query, the paper uses an analysis method called formal context analysis (FCA). We use this method to find the pseudo intent of the query. uh, it is in the form of like a set of k equal to gmi, where g is a set of objects, m is a set of attributes, and I is a subset. Like it shows the relation I between the g objects with the set of attributes m. Now Lavanya is going to continue.
Thank you, Rahul. Here first we'll see what is threat model. Threat model is a structured process which identify the security requirements, threats, and potential vulnerabilities, quantify threat, and also it prioritize the mediation methods. Here consider insider threat. In this paper, we'll discuss mostly about the insider attacks. which is one of the most prevalent security problems, mainly for intelligence community and military. Uh, Insider attacks or insider threat is one of the most dangerous because insiders usually have knowledge about the database and procedures within the organization. These insider attacks can occur in many forms, and in that first one is privilege abuse attacks. This means here the insider retrieves the information with their existing access and use that information for the malicious purposes. And next is the masquerade attacks. Here the adversary or the attacker gets the credentials of the other user to access the system. Here the attacker acts as a other person and use their access to get the information. And next is privilege escalation attack. Here the insider gets or escalates their permissions to access more sensitive data by exploiting a vulnerability of the system or by social engineering. From all these threats, the common point is that the attackers query the database to extract information, but they do not tamper or modify the data. There is a simplified way for monitoring these mechanisms, and the methods they mentioned in this paper is extract relevant features that reflect the user behavior, and next is cluster similar actions, and another one is find outlier actions. And the architecture provided in this paper for query monitoring uses and I think you can hear me, right?
Yeah. Want to change
Okay.
the slide?
Yeah. And the query monitor system observes the interaction between the users, and it doesn't block or change the data, but report if there is any suspicions. And next, when it comes to the complexity analysis, we'll discuss mostly about the two passive attacks. They are harvester attacks and targeted attacks. Harvester attacks is the place like is an attack where the attacker replicate one part of the database for exploratory analysis by querying the database, and it will have a result and it will show high levels of diversity and broadness. And here the diversity is measured by the query and parameter similarity. Broadness is measured by the variety of the return results from the query. And next is harvester threat model. Here the adversaries have domain knowledge about the database schema, but not have any insight about the data, like what the data is, any details related to the data. This attack type does not have any specific target information, so adversary will have only one goal, that is to extract as much information as possible. And next coming to the defense model, as we already discussed that attacker doesn't have any specific target, we'll analyze queries based on the structure and query log. Rahul, can you go to next slide? Next is the targeted attacks. The targeted attacks is a attack where the adversaries will access certain information without needing to know for legitimate purposes, but chooses the attack parameters carefully to avoid being detected. Uh, in this threat model, attacker will use an algorithm which will tell him to stop at a point where they are satisfied with the information they accessed without needing to construct the optimal SQL query. And that attack is, yeah. Next is targeted defense model. They use two approaches to mitigate these attacks. One is misuse detection and another one is anomaly detection. Misuse detection creates its rules on what kind of behavior a user should not perform. And anomaly detection, it finds a deviation from normal patterns by creating user profiles, and it will extract the resources from each queries to create the user profiles. And it also uses clustering algorithm like k-means or hierarchical clustering to label the collected information. Next is analysis of adversarial behavior. Here in our situation, adversaries are insiders who knows the security measures, reaching out for defense strategies and can inquire about the system beforehand to find out the weakness is very easy for them. Here we showed the key risk representation graph. Here S1 represents the state representing the adversary current state, and S2 is the adversary desired state. And if they have if they have key information, they'll go through risk R1, and if they don't have that key, they'll go through R2. Next, Kitty will continue the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Lavanya, for the detailed analysis. So now, coming down to the experimental facts and figures, especially in terms of timing performances, we ran our experiments on a SQL query dataset obtained from a national bank. So here we are particularly interested in the log classifier's time attribute because the particular literature contains extensive experiments on the attack detection, and the biggest performance bottleneck here would be the clustering phase. Our main goal for this study is to show that the clustering operation performs well enough for the practical use of this corporate settings. Our tests are based on SQL query logs, which capture all the query activity of the bank's data set for about 19 hours of period. These logs are firstly anonymized as all the constants are replaced with hash values, and then the logs are also checked manually for safety. After this experiment, we came to know that the data set accounted for a total of more than 2.8 million queries that can be passed. But we tried to focus only on the 1.35 million select queries because we are just looking at the data access patterns here. So the bank query log starts at about 11 a.m. and we vary the number of queries processed by truncating the log after varying lengths. We can find the summary of the log size for each time interval in the right hand side of this slide. Our first observations from this is that there are around 1,614 different query skeletons. This means that the number of distinct structures that we need to cluster is quite small. The second point that we could observe is that in the first 1.5 hours of the trail, over half of all the skeletons were formed. So we can see that as the query log size grows, these queries are converted to skeletons for clustering. As seen in the graph below, the query parsing takes a sublinear amount of time as the log size grows. The main reason for this would profoundly be that the resource allocation costs involved with generating and indexing the new query skeletons, as well as the possible GIT compilation overheads. Uh, the next thing would be that the number of query skeletons increase superlinearly with execution of time for a hierarchical clustering. This is a typical characteristics of such a clustering operation in general, where a whole of n o of n2 pairwise distinct matrices must be computed and evaluated. But fortunately, we can see that the number of skeletons grows sublinearly with the number of queries, and the overall growth is essentially linear over time. We can predict that for longer traces, this growth curve will become sublinear. Coming to the conclusions, Rahul, can you skip to the next slide? So coming to the conclusions and future prospects of this paper, to conclude our key points being discussed in this video, we first analyzed the insider threats against the relational databases by majorly focusing on the complexity aspects of the most common threat models, such as the intent model and the threat model. Next, we proposed the state-of-the-art defense mechanisms to prevent them, like the harvester attacks and its defense mechanism, followed by the targeted attacks and its defense mechanism. We can say that although these methods prove to be effective in approximations, but they don't guarantee an optimal result. However, the NP complete issues can be solved using such reasonable approximation strategies. So we also evaluated the time complexity of launching an attack using these model threats and discussed the defense mechanism to counter these while considering the time complexity. Some of the improvements that and future works proposed for this paper would be firstly to improve the sensitivity level of data that the user have access to, or to construct the user activity graphs to track the fraud detection. Intent to develop the second kind of future aspect would be to develop a real world deployable software to detect such insider threats in order to boost the industry collaboration and participation and so on. So these Rahul, can you move on to the next slide? So this concludes our whole video, and these are some of the reference research papers that we used for making this video. The first paper being the base paper for this presentation. If you have any questions or doubts, please leave a comment and we would be more than happy to address. Thank you.